They searched everywhere but there. Welcome to Detectory. I am your host, Shadow. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Your comments light this channel. Now, listen closely. The February sunlight had that pale, conscientious look it always wore in the village of Little Bracton, as if it meant to do its duty without making a fuss. It lay neatly on the clipped hedges, on the churchyard yews, on the glazed eyes of early crocuses forcing their way up beside the rectory wall. Even the air seemed to smell of propriety, wood smoke, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of jam cooling in someone's kitchen. At the far end of the green, where the war memorial stood with its stern list of names, Mrs. Bantry's annual snowdrop tea was proceeding exactly as it had every year since anyone could remember. There were trestle tables in the village hall, white cloths borrowed from the Women's Institute, and plates arranged with sandwiches cut into triangles, as though any other shape might invite moral collapse. A raffle was in progress, prizes including a knitted tea cozy, a bottle of gooseberry wine that no one ever admitted to making, and a painted biscuit tin said to be quite artistic. In that cautious way, villagers used to praise things that made them uneasy. Miss Marple sat a little apart, as she often did, not from pride, but from habit. Her hands were busy with a length of pale blue wool, needles clicking softly. To a stranger she looked like what she was supposed to look like, a small, harmless old lady with faded eyes and a lace collar. Yet her attention, so gentle it could be mistaken for vagueness, moved quietly from face to face like a cat in long grass. Colonel Hargreaves, upright and ruddy, was lecturing young Mrs. Devine about the way things are going. Mrs. Devine, all bright teeth and bright opinions, she nodded vigorously, her gaze sliding now and then toward the raffle table where her husband, Malcolm Devine, stood talking to the vicar with an earnestness that looked almost like strain. Near the window, Miss Hartnell, who taught at the village school and considered it a moral calling, was speaking in low tones to Elsie Prout, the postmistress, whose sharp little face wore a look of relish. Elsie's ears had the remarkable ability to catch information even when her body was facing another direction entirely. "And I tell you," Elsie murmured, "she was wearing that brooch again, the one with the ruby. You remember, don't you? As if nothing had happened." Miss Hartnell's lips tightened. "It's in very poor taste." "It's in very poor everything," Elsie said, and her eyes flicked toward the door as it opened. A hush, not quite deliberate but unmistakable, moved across the hall. People pretended to rearrange cups, to examine jam tarts, to study the raffle tickets in their hands. The newcomers were Mrs. Arundel and her niece Celia, newly returned after a long absence in London, or so they said. Mrs. Arundel was handsome in a controlled way, her grey hair pinned into perfect obedience. Celia, on the other hand, had the kind of beauty that looked careless, as if she'd simply stepped into it without effort. She smiled, and when several women smiled back with the tight brightness of people showing their teeth. Miss Marple watched them come in, her needles never pausing. She had met Celia once before, years ago, when the girl was a thin, sullen creature with a scraped knee and a habit of staring too long at other people's possessions. Now she moved with confidence, but confidence, Miss Marple had often found, was as fragile as spun sugar. Mrs. Bantry bustled forward, cheeks pink with hospitality. "My dear Lydia." "And Celia. How wonderful. Do come in. We were just starting the raffle." Mrs. Arundel's smile held steady. "We wouldn't miss it," Celia insisted. "She says village teas are frightfully charming." Celia's eyes glinted. "They are. Everyone looks so safe." It might have been nothing. It might have been a joke. Yet Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Bantry's fingers tightened on her handbag just for a moment, and how Colonel Hargreaves's voice faltered as though a word had gone astray. "Now then," Mrs. Bantry said too loudly, "do sit down. There's plenty of cake." Miss Marple's gaze shifted past them to the man who had entered behind. half a step delayed as though he'd been reluctant. Rupert Sedgwick, photographer, recent arrival, and the sort of person who always seemed to be observing even when he pretended not to. He nodded to no one in particular and stood near the notice board with the village announcements. His hands were in his pockets, but his eyes were everywhere. Miss Marple thought, to not unkindly, that Mr. Sedgwick had the look of a man who'd learned early that people were safest when kept at a distance. The raffle went on. Numbers were called. People clapped politely. The painted biscuit tin was won by Mrs. Devine, who laughed too loudly and said she simply adored it while her husband stared at the floor. Outside, somewhere beyond the hall, a dog barked, one sharp, frantic bark, then another. It was an odd sound, not the lazy complaint of a village dog seeing a postman, but something strained, as if the animal had found a truth it didn't want. Miss Marple's needles slowed. A moment later, the hall door burst open, and young Tommy Preece, errand boy for the grocer, cheeks red from running, stood gasping on the threshold. "Mrs. Bantry," he blurted, there's—" His eyes darted around as if the room had suddenly become dangerous. Behind him, Mr. Collins the gardener appeared, hat askew, his expression grey and bewildered. "Don't make a song about it, boy." "Mr. Collins said hoarsely. "We've got to have the police. There's a body." For a second, no one moved. The words didn't fit the room. They belonged to newspapers, to cities, to places where people didn't know each other's teacups. Mrs. Bantry made a small sound, half laugh, half choke. "A body? Don't be ridiculous, Collins. Where on earth?" "In the old priory grounds," Collins said. His voice shook. "By the south wall, in that patch of nettles everyone's always telling me to clear. And only—" he swallowed. "Only no one ever looks there. Not proper." Miss Marple set her knitting on her lap with exquisite care. Around her, chairs scraped back, voices rose in startled bursts, and Elsie Prout's eyes shone like a cat's in lamplight. "No one ever looks there," Miss Marple murmured softly, almost to herself. And then, as if it were merely another small village duty, she rose. The village hall seemed to exhale, cups clinking, chairs scraping, their voices rising as though noise could restore order. Mrs. Bantry, hostess to the bone, clutched her handbag and said, "We mustn't all rush about like hens. Colonel Hargreaves, will you go with Mr. Collins and see what he means? And Malcolm, fetch Dr. Weatherby." Malcolm Devine started at his name, then moved too quickly, nearly colliding with the raffle table. Elsie Prout leaned toward Miss Hartnell and whispered, "Police next. Superintendent Nash, most likely. Nor's the others, not hurriedly." Haste, she had the others, not hurriedly. Haste, she had always thought, was a form of vanity. Outside, February bit at exposed skin. A crowd formed. Mr. Collins led them behind the church, past sleeping gardens, and through the narrow kissing gate into what everyone called the old priory. The priory itself was long gone, but the grounds remained, owned by Mrs. Arundel, yet treated by villagers as a shared ornament. A place to stroll in summer, to pick blackberries in autumn, and, in theory, to admire the south wall that no one admired because brambles and nettles hid it. The barking dog circled a dense patch, hackles raised. Mr. Collins, sweating despite the chill, pushed the nettles aside with the end of a rake he had snatched up in panic. A shoe appeared first, brown leather, expensive, none too clean for little Bracton. Then an arm, pale against dark stalks, and a hand with a wedding ring. Someone, Mrs. Devine perhaps, made a thin sound and sat down hard on the damp grass. Colonel Hargreaves swore. Mr. Bantry, arriving breathless behind his wife, looked as if he might follow Mrs. Devine's example. Miss Marple did not look away, but she looked carefully. The body lay half-turned, as though arranged rather than fallen. The face was toward the wall, cheek pressed into leaf mold. dark hair, too dark, with a faint line of lighter roots. A woman, then, dressed in city good. A tailored coat, gloves that had known no scrubbing, a trace of perfume that should not have survived outdoors. "Don't touch anything," Mrs. Bantry said, and it sounded less like instruction than prayer. Dr. Weatherby arrived 10 minutes later on his bicycle, red-faced and cross at being obliged to pedal in a crisis. He knelt, felt at the neck, then straightened. Dead. Recent? An hour or two, perhaps. See you in this weather. "Who is she?" Mrs. Arundel asked, very quietly. No one quite met her eyes. No one knew. Rupert Sedgwick had drifted close, watching with the peculiar intensity of a man who collected other people's mistakes. He did not take out a camera, but his eyes recorded everything. Miss Marple noticed Malcolm Devine standing a little apart, fists tight, gaze fixed not on the dead woman but on Mrs. Arundel's profile, as though her composure offended him. But then Celia turned her head and looked at Malcolm. It was only a moment, but Miss Marple thought she saw something pass between them, recognition or warning, before Celia lowered her eyes again. A car crunched up the lane like a reprimand. Superintendent Nash climbed out, broad and brisk, with a moustache that suggested discipline. 2 constables followed, one carrying a leather bag. "Right," Nash said. "Everyone back. Mrs. Bantry, you sent word. Good. Now, who found her?" "Me," Mr. Collins said. "I was going to clear that patch, like I'm always told. I put it off because it's a nasty tangle. Then that dog started yapping, and I thought maybe a rabbit had got itself stuck, and... well..." His voice broke on the last word. Nash crouched, peered, then stood and looked around at the onlookers as though selecting the next lie from their faces. "This is Mrs. Arundel's property?" "Yes," Mrs. Arundel said. "Villagers often walk here." "I don't object." "You may now," Nash replied. Ours then softened slightly. "Routine, ma'am. Anyone see a stranger this morning? Any car? Any man hanging about?" The answers came in overlapping fragments. Someone had seen a dark coat near the post office. Someone else had heard a car door. Elsie Prout supplied times and directions with eager exactness. Miss Marple listened until the chorus thinned. Then she said in her mild voice, "Superintendent, may I ask, has anyone checked the little gate by the south wall? The one that opens onto the service track?" Nash looked at her, surprised to find she was not merely scenery. "We'll check everything. Your name, miss?" "Marple," Mrs. Bantry said quickly. "Miss Jane Marple." Nash nodded, already turning away. "Right, keep the crowd off." People drifted back toward the lane, some silent, most whispering. Miss Marple lingered a moment, eyes on the nettles. One thick stalk had been snapped clean and lay across the dead woman's sleeve. It was still fresh, and not yet dulled by cold. Broken after she was placed then, or very shortly before. Her gaze moved to the wall itself. On one stone was a faint smear of pale dust, like chalk brushed by a sleeve. And then, without seeming to stare, she noticed the same pale dust caught along the edge of Celia Arundel's narrow shoe. Celia seemed unaware of it. She stood very straight, one gloved hand resting lightly on her mother's arm, her expression composed but faintly bored. "You look at the shoe again." It was never wise, look at the shoe again. It was never wise to let one's gaze linger where it might be followed. Superintendent Nash began the slow, methodical business of separating the villagers. Statements were to be taken. No one was to leave until spoken to, and the body would be removed only after photographs and preliminary examination. Rupert Sedgwick, watching, wore an unreadable smile at the word photographs. Dr. Weatherby conferred with Nash in low tones. "No visible wounds," he murmured. "At least none obvious from here. Could be poisoning, could be a blow. Hard to tell without moving her." Any sign of a struggle? Nash asked. Not much disturbance. Nettles bent. But that could be from the gardener's rake. Miss Marple let her eyes travel once more over the scene. The nettles were indeed bent, but not crushed, as they might have been had a body fallen heavily. There was an odd neatness to it. The dead woman's coat was unrumpled, her hat missing but hair scarcely disarranged. Even in death she looked curated. Miss Marple. The voice came at her elbow. Mrs. Bantry, cheeks pale now, eyes bright with suppressed agitation. You see how dreadful this is. On Lydia's land, just when she's returned. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. Timing is so often unkind. Mrs. Bantry followed her gaze and lowered her voice. You don't think... Well, it would be too awful. My dear, Miss Marple said, awful things are rarely considerate enough to avoid our gardens. They were summoned in turn. Miss Marple's statement was simple. She had been at the Snowdrop tea since 2:30. She had not left the hall until Mr. Collins' announcement, since she had noticed nothing unusual save the dog's bark. Nash wrote it down briskly, his pen scratching with authority. And you, Miss Marple, he added, have lived here long. Nearly all my life. Then you'll know if the deceased is local. I do not believe I've seen her before, Miss Marple said truthfully, though sometimes faces change. Nash frowned faintly at that and dismissed her. Celia and Mrs. Arundel were questioned together at first, then separately. From a distance, but Miss Marple observed posture more than words. Mrs. Arundel answered with measured clarity. She had been at home all morning. She had arrived at the tea at precisely 3 o'clock. She had not walked near the south wall that day. Celia's account matched her mother's in outline, but differed in texture. She spoke lightly, even cheerfully, as though rehearsing lines in a play she found beneath her talents. Yes, she had walked the grounds earlier. Only briefly. She adored the old stones. No, she had seen no one suspicious. A stranger. In Little Bracton. How exciting. Exciting, Nash repeated flatly. Well, Celia said, tilting her head, one doesn't expect drama here. Malcolm Devine was pale when his turn came. He kept pushing a hand through his hair, leaving it standing in anxious tufts. He had been helping Mrs. Bantry set up tables from 1 o'clock onward, he said. Several could confirm it. Had he left at any point, only to fetch more cups from the vicarage? 5 minutes, no more. And you walked past the priory? Nash asked. Malcolm hesitated. It's the quickest route. Did you see anything? No. The word came too quickly, then softened. Nothing unusual. Elsie Prout supplied an observation unprompted. She had seen a motor car on the service track shortly before 3. Dark green. She was certain of it. Not one of ours, she insisted. Too smart. Nash made a note. Anyone else? There were shrugs, doubtful murmurs. Rupert Sedgwick said he had been in his studio most of the afternoon developing plates. The chemicals, he added dryly, were most disagreeable company, but unlikely to commit murder. Did you hear a car? Nash pressed. Perhaps, Rupert said. One hears many things in a village. Engines, arguments, secrets. By the time the body was finally lifted onto a stretcher and carried toward the waiting vehicle, the winter light had thinned to silver. As it turned, the dead woman's face became visible. There was a collective intake of breath. Even in death, she was striking. High cheekbones, carefully shaped brows, lips still faintly tinted. But it was the expression that unsettled. Less fear than surprise, as though the final moment had caught her unprepared. Mrs. Arundel swayed slightly. Celia's grip tightened on her mother's arm. Malcolm Devine looked away entirely. Miss Marple, watching, noticed something else. On the inside of the woman's wrist, just above the glove line, Nurse addressed the thinning crowd. Until we addressed the thinning crowd, Until we identify her, no one leaves the village without informing me. I'll be speaking to each of you again. If anyone recalls anything at all, however trivial, you'll come forward." People nodded, eager to be useful, eager to be innocent. Miss Marple turned slowly toward the south wall once more. The pale dust upon the stone, the snapped nettle, the absent hat. And in her mind, the curious brightness in Celia's eyes when she had called it exciting. No one ever looked there, Mr. Collins had said. Not proper. And yet someone had known precisely where to place a body so that it would not be seen until it was. The villagers dispersed in subdued knots, their earlier gaiety flattened into urgent whispers. By unspoken agreement, many drifted back toward the hall, as though tea and cake might restore proportion to the afternoon. Miss Marple returned with them, her steps small but steady, her mind moving rather more briskly than her feet. Inside, the white cloths and raffle tickets looked curiously theatrical now, props abandoned after the wrong scene had been played. Mrs. Bantry stood near the urn, issuing cups with mechanical insistence. "We must keep calm," she declared. "There's nothing to be gained by hysteria." "Hysteria?" Elsie Prout said faintly. "A body in the nettles, and you call it hysteria?" Mrs. Bantry shot her a look and pressed a cup into her hand. Miss Marple accepted tea and sat once more in her earlier place. The knitting lay where she had left it. She picked it up, though she did not at once resume. Across the room, Celia Arundel had taken a chair by the window, the fading light caught in her dark hair. She was speaking to Rupert Sedgwick now, and leaning slightly toward him, her posture relaxed. "It's ghastly, of course," she was saying, "but rather dramatic. Don't you think so? A body hidden away like something in a novel." Rupert regarded her with a narrow-eyed amusement. "Novels are tidier," he said. "They usually supply a motive." "Oh, I'm sure we shall have one soon enough," Celia replied lightly. Miss Marple's needles began to click again. A body placed where no one looked, a patch missed her. Collins was forever promising to clear and never quite doing. A service gate onto a track seldom used. It was not a spot chosen at random. It was chosen by someone who understood the habits of the place. Superintendent Nash entered the hall shortly afterward, his presence restoring a kind of order by force of expectation. "The deceased is not from the village," he announced. "No one has yet identified her. We've sent inquiries to nearby towns." "London," Celia said softly, almost to herself. "Ah, in Little Bracton." A ripple passed in Little Bracton. A ripple passed through the room. Nash regarded her for a long moment. "You have an eye for detail, Miss Arundel." "I've always enjoyed clothes," she replied. "Did you enjoy a walk near the south wall this morning?" Nash asked abruptly. There was a silence. Mrs. Arundel stiffened. Celia's expression did not change. "I often walk the grounds. They are ours." "Specifically near the south wall?" "Yes. The stones are picturesque." "And you saw nothing?" "Nothing but nettles," she said. Miss Marple's needles paused once more. Nettles and pale dust. Nash made a note and continued his round of questions. When he reached Malcolm Devine again, the young man's composure had frayed further. "You said you passed the Priory on your way to the vicarage," Nash said. "What time?" "About 20 to 3. "And you saw no one?" Malcolm swallowed. "No." Miss Marple observed that he did not look at Celia now. Instead, his gaze fixed stubbornly on the far wall as if braced against something invisible. Dr. Weatherby cleared his throat. "Superintendent, I've had a closer look at the body. There's a mark at the back of the head. Small but decisive. A blow. Likely delivered by something blunt and heavy." "A stone?" Nash suggested. "Possibly, though I saw none immediately beside her." "A tool?" Mrs. Bantry whispered, glancing involuntarily toward Mr. Collins. Collins shook his head violently. "My rake was by the shed. I'd only just fetched it." Poison? Elsie ventured eagerly. No sign of it as yet, Weatherby replied. The blow seems sufficient. Miss Marple resumed her knitting in earnest now, a blow from behind, in a place screened from casual view. The woman had not struggled much. Surprise, then. Trust, perhaps. Nash closed his notebook. Until we know who she is, speculation will get us nowhere. I'll post a constable at the Priory gate. No one enters without permission. There was a collective murmur of resentment. The Priory grounds were as much a part of village life as the green. Mrs. Arundel rose. Superintendent, I expect full cooperation, she said coolly. But I trust you will also remember that this is my property. I do, ma'am, Nash said, and that may prove important. Her eyes flickered. You're just briefly. As the gathering began to dissolve at last, Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly into her bag. She moved toward the window where Celia stood alone now, Rupert having slipped away. My dear, Miss Marple said gently, how distressing for you to return home and find such unpleasantness. Celia's gaze sharpened, assessing the old lady as one might assess a piece of furniture that had unexpectedly spoken. Yes, she said. Ah, distressing. I have always thought, Miss Marple continued mildly, that one must be very careful where one places things, especially in a village. People have long memories for small changes. Celia smiled again, but the brightness had dimmed a fraction. Do they? I should have thought villagers forgot what they did not wish to see. Miss Marple inclined her head. On the contrary, they merely pretend. Outside, the last of the light faded entirely, leaving the windows reflective and dark. Though in that brief mirror, Miss Marple saw not only Celia's composed face, but, faintly behind it, Malcolm Devine standing near the door, watching. And in his eyes there was something very like fear. Malcolm Devine did not realize he was being observed. His gaze rested on Celia with an intensity that was almost painful, as though he were watching a fuse burn down toward something inevitable. When she turned slightly, catching sight of him in the darkened glass, so his expression altered at once. Flattened, polite, carefully blank. Miss Marple noted the transformation with interest, the hall emptied by degrees. Mrs. Bantry insisted that those most shaken remain for a final cup of tea, though very few drank it. Superintendent Nash spoke quietly with Colonel Hargreaves near the doorway, arranging for the village constable to keep watch at the Priory overnight. The practicalities of crime settled over Little Bracton like frost. Outside, where the cold had sharpened, Miss Marple declined Mrs. Bantry's offer of escort and made her way home alone, the gravel crunching beneath her sensible shoes. The village seemed altered already, each house holding its breath. Curtains twitched, a door closed softly as she passed. She let herself into her cottage and set water to boil before removing her hat. Routine was essential. It steadied the mind. As she measured out tea leaves, she reviewed the afternoon as though sorting wool by color. As a stranger, almost certainly from London, lured or led to a secluded patch of ground. A blow delivered from behind, no immediate sign of struggle. A body placed where no one looked, except that someone must have looked in order to choose it. The snapped nettle, fresh and clean. The pale dust on the wall, the echo of that same dust along the edge of Celia's shoe, and Malcolm Devine's fear. Miss Marple poured the tea and carried it to her small sitting room. From her window she could just see the lane that led toward the Priory service track. A lantern glimmered there now, Nash's constable taking up position. There was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Elsie Prout, cheeks pink from cold and excitement. "I thought you'd not be abed yet," Elsie said breathlessly. "I've heard something." Miss Marple stepped aside. "Come in, Elsie. Warm yourself." Elsie removed her gloves with trembling fingers. A call came through the exchange just after 4, from the Blue Lion in Market Chadwick. "They've a guest missing. Arrived yesterday. Woman matching the description. Registered as Mrs. L. Harrington. Harrington, Miss Marple repeated softly. Yes, and here's the interesting bit. She was expecting to meet someone. That's what the innkeeper says. Asked for directions to Little Bracton this morning. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Did she say whom she was to meet? Elsie leaned forward, eyes bright. No name. It saw, if I saw it, belonged to someone else saw. If I saw it, belonged to someone else entirely. Perhaps, Miss Marple said gently. Or perhaps she was collected. Elsie shivered. You think someone from here? I think, Miss Marple replied, that people seldom travel to villages without reason, and reasons are rarely simple. Elsie stayed only long enough to finish her tea and repeat the story twice more for emphasis. When she had gone, Miss Marple sat very still. Mrs. L. Harrington, a married name then. Yet no one in Little Bracton had claimed recognition. That in itself was suggestive. If the meeting had been private, it was likely arranged in advance. A letter, a telephone call, something discreet. There came another knock, firmer this time. Malcolm Devine stood on the step, and hatless despite the cold. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed. Miss Marple, he said abruptly, may I speak with you? Of course, Mr. Devine. Come in. He remained standing as though sitting would commit him to more than he intended. I've done nothing wrong, he said at once. I did not suggest you had, Miss Marple replied mildly. They'll start talking, he went on. They always do. I walked past the priory. Yes, but I saw no body. Nothing. What did you see? Miss Marple asked softly, and he hesitated. His hands clenched and unclenched. Someone. By the south wall, a woman. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. Alive? Yes, I think so. She was standing, waiting, perhaps. I couldn't see her face, only her coat. And you did not stop? No. The word came out ragged. I had no business there, and I thought... He broke off. You thought, Miss Marple prompted. I thought it was best not to be seen. By whom? She asked gently. His silence answered her more clearly than speech. Did you recognize the coat? Miss Marple inquired. He shook his head. It wasn't Celia's, he said quickly, too quickly. If that's what you're thinking. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. I was thinking only that fear often tells us more than fact. Malcolm drew a breath as though steadying himself. If that woman came to meet someone here, she didn't come for me, he said. I swear it. I'm sure you believe that, Miss Marple said. He stared at her. Her eyes went very still. Outside, a faint wind went very still. Outside, a faint wind moved through the hedges. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. Malcolm's stillness was more eloquent than denial. For a long moment he stood there, the ticking of Miss Marple's small mantel clock measuring out his silence. I won't have Celia dragged into this, he said at last, too low and strained. Miss Marple's expression did not alter. Into what, Mr. Devine? He flushed. You know what I mean. People talk. They've never forgiven her for leaving, for being different. And you? Miss Marple asked gently. Have you forgiven her? His eyes lifted, startled by the question. Whatever answer formed there did not reach his lips. Instead he said, she had nothing to do with that woman. You are certain of it? Yes. The word came with force, though whether of conviction or desperation was less clear. Miss Marple poured another cup of tea and pushed it toward him. He did not sit, but after a moment he took the cup, holding it as though it steadied him. You said you saw the woman alive, Miss Marple continued quietly. Standing near the south wall. Yes. At 20 to 3. About that. And she appeared to be waiting. I think so. She wasn't walking. Just standing. Facing which direction? Malcolm frowned, eyes searching his memory. Toward the service gate, as if expecting someone from the track. Miss Marple nodded almost imperceptibly. And you did not see anyone approach? No. Did she see you? I don't think so. I kept my head down. A small, reflective silence followed. Then Miss Marple said, Mr. Devine, when people meet in secluded places, it is seldom for innocent reasons. Yet innocence and guilt are not always where one expects to find them. He looked at her sharply. Yes, you don't think she was meeting Celia? I think, Miss Marple replied, that if she had been meeting Miss Arundel openly, she would not have needed to hide among nettles. Malcolm let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since he arrived. You care for her, Miss Marple observed, not unkindly. He stared into his tea. I always have. Does your wife know that? His head jerked up. That's not fair. No, Miss Marple agreed softly. Life seldom is. He set the cup down abruptly. I should go. Yes, she said. And Mr. Devine, if Superintendent Nash asks again, you must tell him what you told me. Secrets, even protective ones, have a way of souring. He hesitated, then nodded once and left. When the door had closed behind him, Miss Marple returned to her chair. The pattern was emerging, though still faint as chalk on stone. A woman from Market Chadwick, calling herself Mrs. L. Harrington, arrives with a private appointment in Little Bracton. She walks to the Priory grounds. Malcolm sees her waiting near the service gate at 20 to 3. By 3 o'clock, she is dead. The green motor car. Elsie's sharp eyes were seldom mistaken. If the woman came on foot, someone else must have used the track. Miss Marple rose and went to her small escritoire. From a drawer, she took out an old parish map of the village and its surroundings. The service track ran behind the priory wall, connecting to a narrow lane seldom travelled except by those who preferred not to be noticed. She traced it with one finger. There came another knock, lighter this time. Celia Arundel stood outside, her dark coat buttoned to the throat. The night air had coloured her cheeks, but her eyes were clear and composed. "May I come in, Miss Marple?" she asked. "Of course, my dear." Celia entered, glancing briefly around the modest sitting room as though assessing it. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." Celia removed her gloves slowly. "I gather Malcolm has been here." Miss Marple's gaze rested on her face. "He called." "I thought he might." A faint smile touched Celia's lips. "He has always been loyal, excessively so." "Loyalty is a virtue," Miss Marple said. "It can also be tiresome," Celia replied lightly. She moved toward the fire, holding out her hands to the warmth. "You have known this village a long time, Miss Marple. Oh, you understand how quickly suspicion grows." "It thrives in close soil," Miss Marple agreed. Celia turned, studying her. "Then you must also understand that I would hardly commit murder on my own property. It would be absurd." "Absurd things occur daily," Miss Marple said gently. "But they are rarely planned." Celia's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think this was planned?" "I think the meeting was arranged." Celia did not immediately respond. Instead, she said, "I walked near the south wall this morning. That is true. I often do. The stones are old. I like old things." "Old things have a habit of remembering," Miss Marple murmured. Celia's smile returned, faint but deliberate. "You are very observant." "One must be at my age." There was a pause. Then Celia said, almost casually, "If this Mrs. Harrington came to meet someone, perhaps she chose the wrong person." "Or the right one," Miss Marple suggested. For a fraction of a second, so quite beside the point. Celia regarded quite beside the point. Celia regarded her a moment longer, then reached for her gloves. "Superintendent Nash will find nothing. There is nothing to find." "That," Miss Marple said softly, remains to be seen. When Celia had gone, Miss Marple stood by the window once more. And who knew precisely where to stand? The who knew precisely where to stand. The following morning dawned clear and pitilessly bright, as though the sky itself refused to acknowledge the previous day's violence. Frost edged the hedgerows, and the priory wall stood stark against the pale blue, every imperfection exposed. Miss Marple was up early. She had always believed that truth, like certain small birds, was best observed at first light. After a modest breakfast, she wrapped herself well and made her way toward the churchyard path that bordered the priory grounds. A constable still stood at the main gate, stamping his feet for warmth. He touched his helmet politely. "Morning, miss. Orders are no one's to enter." "I quite understand," Miss Marple replied. "I merely wish to take my usual walk along the boundary." He nodded, and relieved to encounter no resistance. From the outside path, one could see the upper portion of the south wall. The nettle patch itself was hidden from this angle, but the service track beyond lay visible through gaps in the trees. It bore the faint parallel marks of recent tires, two distinct sets, Miss Marple thought, though frost had blurred their edges. She did not linger long. Observation, when too obvious, invites attention. Instead, she turned toward the post office. Elsie Prout was already at her counter, radiating restrained excitement. "You've heard?" Elsie began at once. "I've heard several things," Miss Marple said. "Which one do you mean?" "They've identified her. Mrs. Laura Harrington, from London. Married, though apparently living apart from her husband. Superintendent Nash received confirmation by telephone at 8. Indeed. And there's more. A letter was found in her handbag. Not signed, but giving instructions. Meet me at the south wall of the priory at 3 o'clock. Come alone. It concerns your future." Miss Marple absorbed this without visible reaction. "Typed?" "No, handwritten. Nash wouldn't say whose hand, of course, but he's collecting samples." "How sensible," Miss Marple murmured. Elsie leaned closer. "If you ask me, it smells of blackmail." "It often does," Miss Marple agreed gently. As she left the post office, she encountered Rupert Sedgwick outside his small studio. He was smoking, though the cigarette had burned almost to the filter without being drawn upon. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I imagine the village is enjoying itself immensely." "Enjoyment seems a curious word," she replied. "Scandal, then. It suits Little Bracton better." "You do not sound surprised," she observed. "By murder?" "No, people are far less original than they believe." He studied her a moment. "You think she knew her killer?" "I think she expected to meet someone she trusted sufficiently to come alone." Rupert's mouth twitched. "Trust is an overrated commodity." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said, "it is the most dangerous one." He flicked ash onto the frosted ground. "Nash has asked for my handwriting." "And yours is distinctive," she said mildly. "So I've been told." He met her gaze squarely. "You suspect me." "I suspect everyone," Miss Marple replied. "It is so much more democratic." He laughed softly, though there was no warmth in it. Further along the lane, she found Mrs. Bantry in animated discussion with Colonel Hargreaves. "It's intolerable," Mrs. Bantry was saying. "Lydia is beside herself. A London woman summoned to her land by an anonymous note." Colonel Hargreaves cleared his throat. "If it is blackmail, the question is, who stood to lose?" Miss Marple approached quietly. "Loss," she said, "is often the clearest motive." "Mrs. Bantry seized upon her words. "Exactly. And Celia has had, difficulties in London, hasn't she?" "Haven't we all?" Miss Marple replied gently. The Colonel frowned. "You don't mean to suggest—" "I suggest nothing," she said. "I observe." By late morning, Superintendent Nash had summoned several villagers to the hall once more. Handwriting samples were collected with bureaucratic patience. Malcolm Devine's hand shook slightly as he wrote. Celia's script was elegant, controlled. Sir Rupert's slanted sharply to the right. Mrs. Arundel's was precise and upright. Miss Marple watched from a corner seat, knitting in hand. At noon, Nash addressed them. Preliminary examination indicates the blow was delivered by a heavy object consistent with a stone from the wall itself. No weapon has been recovered yet. The letter will be examined in detail. He paused. Mrs. Harrington withdrew a substantial sum of money from her bank 2 days ago, Nash said. Or perhaps the money was Nash said. Or perhaps the money was payment. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Payment implied transaction. Transaction implied prior understanding. Her thoughts returned to Malcolm's account, the woman waiting, facing the service gate. If she expected someone arriving by car, she would stand thus. If she feared exposure, she would choose a secluded meeting. Oz approached her, urgency in his step. You approached her, urgency in his step. You must tell him, Malcolm said under his breath. Tell him what? Celia replied coolly. Whatever this is, it will come out. She regarded him steadily. Only if someone speaks. And if someone dies, he demanded softly. Her gaze did not waver. People die every day. Miss Marple, passing close enough to hear, he felt a quiet certainty settle within her. The body had been placed where no one looked, but the meeting itself had been arranged where someone very much intended to be seen by exactly one pair of eyes. That afternoon the frost had melted into a thin dampness that made the village paths treacherous underfoot. Miss Marple walked carefully, though her thoughts moved with increasing clarity. Payment. Withdrawal of a substantial sum. A letter promising that the meeting concerned Mrs. Harrington's future. Such phrasing was rarely accidental. It suggested leverage, knowledge capable of altering prospects, perhaps reputations. Reputations in Little Bracton were delicate things. They endured for decades, yet could fracture in an instant. Miss Marple turned her steps toward the Blue Lion in Market Chadwick the following morning, traveling by the midday bus. The journey was uneventful, and she passed it in quiet contemplation, her gloved hands folded neatly over her handbag. And the innkeeper, Mr. Peters, proved obliging in the face of polite inquiry. Mrs. Harrington had arrived alone, he confirmed. Well-dressed, reserved, not unfriendly. She had asked specifically for directions to Little Bracton and whether there was a discreet way to approach the priory grounds. Discreet, Miss Marple repeated mildly. Aye, Mr. Peters said. She didn't want to come through the main road, so I told her about the service track that runs behind the wall. Most outsiders don't know it. Miss Marple inclined her head. And did she receive any visitors? None that I saw, though she posted a letter from here the evening she arrived. To Little Bracton? I couldn't say, but it was local postage. Miss Marple thanked him and returned by the afternoon bus, her mind fitting this new piece into place. If Mrs. Harrington posted a letter locally, then someone in Little Bracton received it, and the meeting at the South Wall was not solely at the instigation of the unknown correspondent. It may have been the culmination of an exchange already begun. Upon her return, she found Superintendent Nash waiting at her cottage gate. Miss Marple, he said, removing his hat. May I trouble you for a moment? Of course, Superintendent. They sat in her small parlor. Nash's manner was brisk, yet there was a thread of reluctant respect in his tone. You seem to possess a talent for noticing what others overlook, he began. I'm told you asked about the service gate before anyone mentioned it. It is often the less used paths that matter most, she replied. He studied her. We've compared handwriting. None of the samples match the letter exactly. However, there are similarities in phrasing with another document. Indeed? A note found in Mrs. Harrington's luggage. Unsigned. Years ago. A scandal avoided. A debt years ago. A scandal avoided. A debt owed. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened faintly. To whom? That is less clear. But the name Arundel appears. The room seemed to grow quieter. I see, Miss Marple said softly. Nash leaned forward. You've known the Arundels a long time. Yes. Any history of scandal? Miss Marple folded her hands. Scandal is a broad word, Superintendent. Young people make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes travel with them. And sometimes, Nash said grimly, they return. He rose. I'll be speaking with Mrs. Arundel again. After he left, Miss Marple remained seated, her thoughts steady and grave. Celia had left Little Bracton abruptly several years ago, amid whispers too vague to take shape. There had been talk of unsuitable company in London, of financial entanglements, and of a broken engagement that had not entirely been her choice. A scandal avoided, a debt owed. By early evening the news had spread. Superintendent Nash had searched the Arundel house. Nothing conclusive had been found, but the tension in the village had sharpened. Miss Marple encountered Malcolm Devine near the green. He looked worn, as though sleep had abandoned him. They're turning on her, he said hoarsely. They're asking questions, Miss Marple corrected gently. So she didn't kill that woman. Did she meet her? Miss Marple asked quietly. Malcolm's jaw tightened. I don't know. But you suspect she did. He closed his eyes briefly. Celia wrote letters before she left London. I saw one once. Torn up. There was a name. Harrington. Miss Marple absorbed this without visible reaction. And you did not think it important? I thought it was over, he said. Whatever it was. Very few things are ever entirely over, she murmured. As dusk fell once more, a constable arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with unexpected news. The missing money had been found. Where? She asked. In the hollow of the old yew by the south wall, he replied, wrapped in oilcloth. Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. Discovered how? The dog from yesterday wouldn't leave the tree. Payment hidden, not taken. Concealed near the body's resting place. When the constable had gone, Miss Marple stood by her window, looking toward the darkened outline of the priory grounds. And if robbery had been the motive, the money would have vanished. If blackmail, it might have changed hands. Instead, it had been hidden, perhaps intended for retrieval, perhaps planted to mislead. A meeting arranged, a past resurrected, a debt implied. And somewhere between trust and betrayal, a blow delivered from behind. The discovery of the money unsettled the village more than its disappearance had done. Hidden in the hollow of the old yew, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, it was a curious instinct. The truly guilty was a curious instinct. The truly guilty often destroyed. The uncertain preferred to hide. The following morning, Superintendent Nash called a small conference at the vicarage, requesting the presence of Mrs. Arundel, Celia, Malcolm Devine, and, somewhat to Mrs. Bantry's open satisfaction, Miss Marple herself. The drawing room was cool and formal. Mrs. Arundel sat very upright, gloved hands folded in her lap as though attending a recital. Celia stood near the mantel, one shoulder resting lightly against it, her expression composed but watchful. Malcolm hovered near the window, pale and tense. Nash wasted little time. The money recovered from the yew tree amounts precisely to the sum withdrawn by Mrs. Harrington, he began. That suggests the meeting was financial in nature. Or theatrical, Celia said lightly. Perhaps she wished to appear dramatic. Nash ignored the remark. We have also confirmed that Mrs. Harrington and Miss Arundel were acquainted in London some years ago. Mrs. Arundel's gaze shifted to her daughter, but she said nothing. Miss Arundel? Nash prompted. Celia inclined her head. Yes, we met socially. It was hardly intimate. And yet, Nash continued, a draft letter found among Mrs. Harrington's belongings refers to an incident in which she claims to have protected you from serious consequence. Silence settled heavily. Malcolm's hand tightened on the window frame. What incident? Mrs. Arundel demanded, her composure cracking at last. Celia did not look at her mother. A misunderstanding, she said. An investment that failed. Laura, Mrs. Harrington introduced me to certain people. I withdrew before matters became unpleasant. Unpleasant in what way? Nash asked. In the way that London society can be unpleasant, she replied coolly. Debts, expectations. Debts that Mrs. Harrington may have settled on your behalf. Celia's lips curved faintly. If she did, she never sent me a bill. Miss Marple watched closely. There was no tremor in Celia's voice, yet a fine line had appeared between her brows. Nash turned to Malcolm. Were you aware of this association? Malcolm hesitated. I knew she'd had friends in London. Did you know she was meeting Mrs. Harrington on the day of her death? No, he said firmly. I did not. Miss Marple spoke then, her tone mild but clear. Superintendent, may I ask, at what time do you believe Mrs. Harrington arrived at the South Wall? Shortly before 3, Nash replied, based on witness accounts. And the blow? She asked. Likely delivered within minutes of that time. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Devine saw a woman standing near the service gate at 20 to 3. Alive. Nash's eyes sharpened. He has since told me. Celia's gaze flickered toward Malcolm, something unreadable passing between them. Miss Marple continued gently. The woman was waiting, facing the track, expecting someone arriving by car, perhaps. The green motor, Nash said. Quite possibly, Miss Marple agreed. He turned to Celia. Do you own such a vehicle? No. Does anyone in your household? No. Did you walk to the South Wall that afternoon? I told you, I often walk there. But did you meet Mrs. Harrington? Celia's pause was brief, almost imperceptible. No. Miss Marple observed that she had answered the question precisely as asked. Nash began to pace. If the money was intended as payment, it was never exchanged. If it was to be hidden, the killer had opportunity. Unless, Miss Marple said softly, the hiding occurred before the blow. All eyes turned to her. Before? Nash repeated. Yes. Suppose Mrs. Harrington arrived early. Suppose she concealed the money herself. He's intending to retrieve it after discussion, perhaps as leverage. Why hide it? Malcolm demanded. To prevent immediate seizure, Miss Marple replied, if she feared coercion. Nash considered this. Then the killer may not have known where the money was. Precisely. A silence followed, dense with implication. Mrs. Arundel spoke at last, her voice low. Celia, tell me plainly, did this woman threaten you? Celia's composure faltered for the first time. She reminded me of things best forgotten, she said. But I was not afraid of her. Were you angry? Nash asked. Everyone is angry about something, she returned. Miss Marple rose slowly. Superintendent, may I suggest something further? He gestured for her to continue. The body was placed neatly. The nettles were bent, not crushed. The blow was delivered from behind. That speaks of proximity, of someone she allowed close. Someone she trusted, Malcolm said hoarsely. Or someone who approached under the guise of trust, Miss Marple corrected gently. Celia's eyes met hers then, cool and searching. Outside, a sudden commotion broke the tension. A shout from the lane, followed by hurried footsteps. A constable burst into the room breathless. Superintendent, there's been another incident. Nash stiffened. What now? Rupert Sedgwick, Found in his studio. Unconscious. Looks like a fall, but there's blood. The room seemed to tilt, as though the ground beneath little Bracton had shifted once more. Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty settle within her. The first blow had not concluded matters. It had only begun them. They reached Rupert Sedgwick's studio within minutes. The small building stood just off the green, its windows half-curtained, the faint chemical scent of developer drifting into the cold air. A knot of villagers had already gathered, held back by a constable with limited success. Inside, the scene was stark. Rupert lay on the floor beside his work table, one arm twisted awkwardly beneath him. A dark stain spread slowly across the wooden boards from a cut at his temple. A heavy brass paperweight, normally used to anchor drying prints, had fallen nearby. Dr. Weatherby knelt beside him. "He's alive," he announced after a moment. Unconscious, but breathing steadily. The wound's shallow. Could be a fall. "Could be," Nash echoed, his gaze sweeping the room. The studio bore signs of disturbance, though not violent chaos. A chair had been knocked over. Several photographic plates lay shattered on the floor, their glass fragments glittering like ice. On the table, an envelope lay open. Nash picked it up carefully. Inside was a single sheet of photographic paper. It bore the image of the Priory's south wall. More precisely, it showed a figure standing near the nettle patch, half turned toward the service gate. The image was faint, taken at distance, but unmistakable. Mrs. Laura Harrington, alive, and approaching her, partially obscured by shadow, was another figure, Celia Arundel. A collective intake of breath filled the small room. Malcolm swayed as though struck, Mrs. Arundel's face drained of color. Nash's voice hardened. "When was this taken?" "One of yesterday's plates," Dr. Weatherby said, glancing around. "Still damp." Miss Marple stepped closer, careful not to touch anything. "The angle suggests it was taken from the upper window," she observed quietly, overlooking the track. Rupert had positioned himself where he could observe the meeting unseen. Nash turned sharply, which means he saw them together. "And perhaps," Miss Marple added gently, "more than he was meant to see." Celia stood very still. Her eyes were fixed on the photograph, not with shock but with something closer to calculation. "I went for a walk," she said calmly. "If Mr. Sedgwick chose to spy on me, that is hardly my fault." "Did you meet Mrs. Harrington?" Nash demanded. Celia's chin lifted. "Yes." The admission fell into the room like a stone. Mrs. Arundel made a strangled sound. "Celia." "I met her," Celia repeated. "She demanded money, claimed she had protected me from scandal in London, that she could just as easily expose it." "And did you agree to pay?" Nash asked. "No." "Then why was she carrying the exact sum she withdrew?" Celia hesitated. Perhaps she expected to persuade me." "Did you strike her?" Nash's voice was sharp now. "No." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "What happened after you met?" Celia's eyes flicked toward her, wary. "We argued. She threatened to speak to my mother, to the village. I told her it would do no good. Then I left." "At what time?" Nash pressed. "Just before 3. "And you saw no one else?" "No." Malcolm found his voice. "That's not true?" Celia turned on him. "Malcolm, I saw you," he said, his face pale but resolute. "By the wall. You weren't walking away. You were standing close to her." The silence thickened. Nash's gaze shifted between them. "Mr. Devine, you told me you saw only a woman waiting." "I lied," Malcolm said. "I didn't want her dragged into it." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, not in disapproval but in recognition. Loyalty, indeed. "Did you see the blow struck?" Nash asked. Malcolm shook his head. "No. I saw them arguing. Then I heard something. A dull sound. I thought it was a stone falling. I hurried on." "Why didn't you check?" Nash demanded. I was afraid, Malcolm whispered. Miss Marple looked again at the photograph. Celia's figure was turned slightly, one arm raised, not in violence, but in emphasis. The image froze a moment before culmination. Superintendent, she said softly, may I suggest that the photograph tells us something else? Nash glanced at her impatiently. What? The position of the figures. Mrs. Harrington is facing the service gate. Miss Arundel approaches from within the grounds. Yes. If Miss Arundel left after the argument, she would have walked back toward the house. Yet the blow was delivered from behind. Nash frowned. Meaning? Meaning that the person who struck Mrs. Harrington approached from the direction of the track. All eyes turned toward the doorway instinctively. The green motor, Nash murmured. Precisely, Miss Marple said. Miss Arundel argued with her, yes. No, at Rupert's still form. He photographed at Rupert's still form. He photographed the meeting, Miss Marple continued. He may have photographed what followed. If he developed more plates, someone had reason to silence him. Nash's jaw tightened. Search the place. A constable moved to the darkroom. Moments later, he called out, Superintendent, there's another plate here. Cracked, but visible. Nash hurried in. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance. The second image was blurred, as though taken in haste. It showed Mrs. Harrington crumpling forward, and behind her, a man stepping back toward the service gate. The face was indistinct, but the posture unmistakable. Malcolm Devine. The blurred image lay under the lamplight in Rupert Sedgwick's dark room, there its cracked surface catching reflections like a fractured mirror. Malcolm Devine stared at it as though it were some grotesque parody of himself. That isn't, he began, then faltered. In the photograph, the figure was stepping back, one arm slightly extended. The angle obscured the face, yet the stance, the cut of the coat, the line of the shoulders, these were cruelly familiar. Superintendent Nash's voice was clipped. You were there. You admitted as much. I told you I saw them arguing, Malcolm said hoarsely. I left before anything happened. Miss Marple regarded the image thoughtfully. The human eye, she said quietly, is far more reliable than a blurred plate. Nash shot her a look. You doubt the evidence? I question its interpretation, she replied. Mr. Devine, when you saw the two women, where were you standing? On the inner path, he said. Near the bend, as I could see them through the trees. And the service gate, she prompted. Behind her, on the track. Miss Marple nodded. Then if you had struck Mrs. Harrington and stepped back, you would have retreated toward the house, not the gate. Malcolm's head lifted slightly. The figure in the photograph, Miss Marple continued, is moving toward the service gate, away from the grounds. Nash frowned at the image. It's blurred. Indeed, she said gently. But blur does not alter direction. Silence gathered as understanding began to shift. Celia stood rigid, her earlier composure stripped away. You're suggesting someone arrived from the track, she said. I am, Miss Marple answered. And struck her after I left? Yes. Nash's gaze sharpened. The green motor? Quite, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Harrington expected to meet someone arriving by car, as she concealed the money in the U, likely before Miss Arundel arrived, intending to retrieve it after the conversation. She argued with Miss Arundel. Mr. Devine witnessed part of that quarrel and fled. Mrs. Harrington remained, perhaps unsettled, perhaps reconsidering. And then, Nash pressed. Then the true appointment arrived. All eyes turned toward the unconscious Rupert as though he might supply the missing voice. Mr. Sedgwick positioned himself to observe. Miss Marple went on. He photographed the meeting between the two women. He then waited, curious, perhaps sensing drama. He saw a motor car approach along the track. Who? Nash demanded. Miss Marple folded her hands. Who among us knew of the service track well enough to approach unseen? Who had reason to fear Mrs. Harrington's revelations more than Miss Arundel? Mrs. Arundel made a faint sound. Fear. What could I possibly— Your daughter's future, Miss Marple said softly. Her reputation, your own standing. So the tea began, Miss Marple continued. The tea began, Miss Marple continued. You slipped away briefly. No one remarked it in the commotion. You drove by the track, perhaps intending to ensure the matter was concluded discreetly. That's absurd, Mrs. Arundel said coldly. Is it? Miss Marple's voice remained mild. You are practical, Mrs. Arundel, decisive. When Miss Arundel refused payment, Mrs. Harrington threatened exposure. Exposure would not only damage Celia, it would expose your involvement. Nash watched Mrs. Arundel closely now. You confronted Mrs. Harrington after Miss Arundel departed, Miss Marple said. There was little time. The blow was swift, a stone from the wall, impersonal, effective. You then concealed the money in the U, intending perhaps to retrieve it later and suggest robbery. Mrs. Arundel's gloved hands trembled faintly. And Mr. Sedgwick? Nash asked. He developed the plates and saw more than was safe, Miss Marple replied. He likely confronted Mrs. Arundel or implied that he might sell the image. Another decisive act followed. Mrs. Arundel rose abruptly. You cannot prove any of this. No, Miss Marple agreed gently. But you can. The room seemed to contract. For years, Miss Marple continued, you have managed appearances. But appearances are fragile. Not yesterday, when the constable mentioned the yew tree, you looked not surprised, but alarmed. Mrs. Arundel's composure fractured at last. She would have ruined her, she said in a low, shaking voice. Laura was reckless. She would have told everything. So you silenced her, Nash said grimly. I protected my daughter, Mrs. Arundel replied fiercely. I always have. Celia stared at her mother as though seeing her anew. You followed me, she whispered. So I couldn't risk you handling it alone, Mrs. Arundel said. You are impulsive. The silence that followed was heavier than accusation. Nash signaled to the constable. Mrs. Arundel, I must ask you to come with me. She straightened, dignity returning like armor. Very well. As she was led away, Celia remained motionless, her earlier brightness extinguished. Malcolm stepped toward her, but she did not look at him. Miss Marple turned quietly toward the door. Outside, the village green lay peaceful once more beneath a pale sky. Little Bracton would recover. It always did. Tea would be poured again, curtains would twitch, but somewhere in its quiet hedgerows lingered the truth Miss Marple knew too well, that human nature, like nettles by an old stone wall, thrives precisely where no one chooses to look.